And we're live.
Excellent. Hey, buddy. How you doing?
Good, man. How are you?
Yes, dashing around London whilst thinking about geopolitics. It's a funny combination of the local and the global.
You just hopped off your bicycle and you're riding across London. That sounds
Yeah,
like such an idyllic lifestyle.
it's not really
You're
idyllic.
like
It's
Mr.
more like
Idyllic
full on.
lifestyle guy or
No,
something.
idyllic is the opposite. It's traffic and sort of dodging over 5 or 6 lanes of traffic in order to head around.
Oh,
So it's exciting. Idyllic, maybe not. Yeah.
you don't have a little basket with flowers on the front of your bicycle like a 1950s
No, I think you're thinking of 1950s Oxford rather than 2020s, London, maybe. Yeah, it's not really like that, though. Think New York in the rush
like
hour rather than,
like a Harry Potter
yeah, Harry Potter.
movie or
Yes,
something.
exactly. It's not Harry Potter. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I get it. All right, man. You ready to do a podcast today?
Yeah, let's do this. Interesting
All
topic as
right.
ever. I always,
Yeah.
always find this, it's a full-on topic, which is not fun to deal with in some ways when you're dealing with problems. But on the other hand, because it's a knotty problem, it forces you to be creative and analytical in a good combination, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
interesting and makes us better entrepreneurs for sure, because we have no choice.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, totally agree. All right, well, you've got a great title for this episode and a phrase I love: waterproof. You waterproof your e-commerce business against geopolitics. You want to do the intro and kick us off here? Let's get
Yeah,
this
I'll
thing
do
going,
that.
man. Yeah,
Yeah. Today, we're going to talk about how to waterproof your e-commerce business against geopolitical storms that are coming. A suitable seafaring metaphor for a global situation. Maybe it's a British kind of habit to talk naval metaphors. Just a reminder of the problems which we discussed in the last episode. And if you didn't catch that, might be worth catching that. The simple version is the demand side means increasing consumer costs on home heating, travel, and food costs means that there is quite a challenge for consumers to have discretionary spending power, which means they may well spend a lot less on a lot of categories, or types of price points may be challenged as well. We're already seeing that, I believe, in the latest economic data in America. It's now the 30th of April when recording this, 2022. But I imagine if you're listening to this in months down the line, it will be only more of the same. And then on the supply side, massive constraints. There's zero COVID policy in China currently, very, very active. Again, if you're listening later in 2022 or even 23, that may well still be the case. There's a containers shortage, container ship shortage. And then, of course, oil cost and availability has been hugely challenged by the Russia-Ukraine war. There could indeed, by the time you're listening to this, be another war in the Middle East, which happens every so often. And raw materials such as metals are both more expensive and harder to get. So that's the situation we're in. So we got some big global problems. We need some big solutions, and that's what we're focused on today. Jason, are you
yeah.
ready to plunge into some geopolitical strategic solutions?
I am indeed, and
Excellent.
I think we've got a good little list here of strategies and tactics that people can employ to waterproof their business against the storm. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, let's jump into it, man. You want to kick these topics off, or how do you want to go?
Yes. So I want to just talk about sort of meta strategies, if you like, of two things that I think we've discussed before about diversification and pivoting, or rather, the sort of link between the two is preparing to pivot. So diversifying is
Hmm.
is a classic investor's way of thinking about managing risk. And as entrepreneurs, we have a habit of focusing very hard on a small niche, which is often a very wise thing. And we often focus on one or two supply sources, which is actually often not a wise thing. But because there's only one of me and one of you and one of anyone who's running a business, unless you have a massive team, which tends to be hard to get and expensive, then we haven't got the bandwidth to think about diversification. And unfortunately, I believe that in the current situation, that's no longer an option. I don't think it's a nice to have. I think it's a must have. The good news is if you've diversified, for example, the markets we'll talk about the different types, the markets you sell into, or the places you get goods from, to put it into simple terms, then you have the option to pivot. And that's really something that, again, a lot of us may be forced into. The only other thing I'd say on this, and I love your thoughts on this, is diversification is a choice. A pivot is often a forced thing. You have to pivot. So you do. But you can only pivot if you have somewhere else to go. If you have one plan and that plan ceases to work, then you're kind of done, and it's shutting the doors time. And that's the main thing to avoid. So I think that's the driving force of all this. Why are we bothering with this? Is like we have to find a
Yeah.
way for business continuity, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, you on the outline, you put the word diversification, and I something about that didn't strike me as quite right, and but I get your point, and I,
Mm,
agree that you wanna be ready to diversify, but I'm not sure it's diversification that you're really seeking. I think maybe the word that came to my mind was be nimble.
mhm.
In other words, be ready to diversify, but you might not be diversifying, you might just be switching. That be ready to switch suppliers, ready to switch sales channels, ready to switch, team or work style. I mean, I saw one company announced yesterday that I think it was Airbnb. Their whole business now, you can live any if you work for them, you can
Mm,
live anywhere in the world and work remotely, and they'll bring teams together. But that's their new policy forever. And they so the nimbleness to make changes, I think, is crucial in the kind of environment we're entering into. And I think that's the core mental, strategic piece. And so I guess that's just a little different than, diversify.
yeah.
Hopefully you don't have to diversify. Hopefully your
Yes.
business stays together and it's beautiful and you just continue to scale. But maybe you do have a problem, or maybe you have a sales channel problem, and you need to be ready to make changes. And I think it's the readiness, the preparation to change, that's the
Mm.
central thesis that I think would go into this time of geopolitical challenges and storms, kind of geared with and armed with. What are your
Yeah, I
thoughts
think
on
you're
that?
right. I mean, it could be that for some people, diversification would make sense, meaning, well, we'll get into some details, but for example, if you just sell in UK, for example, you might choose to sell in the UK and a little bit in America. So that would be straight up diversification. It could be that you, in some cases, as you're saying, and I agree entirely, are preparing to pivot, but don't press the go button. So you start exploring suppliers in Mexico, for example, which is bound to be harder work in most cases and possibly less reliable, less quality than your current suppliers in China. That might be a very typical scenario. In that case, I'd entirely agree. You want to prepare to pivot, but you wouldn't necessarily press the go button immediately because it could be a lot of time and
Yeah,
energy in the wrong way. So,
yeah.
absolutely. And so, yes, preparing is the key. I think you're right. And then nimble is a great word. Well, look, let's go through these. We've got multiple strategies here. I think we sort of put them into three buckets, if I'm right, maybe
Hmm.
four.
Yeah.
So, well, let's go. So you mentioned the word nimble. Tell me about your thoughts about the word nimble. I like that, but how does this play out in this scenario for you?
Well, I mean, I think the first question is, do you have the mind share, mental and emotional energy, the bandwidth to say, okay, I could make changes. I could make changes all day long. Some of us just get worn out. We're just too tired to say that. We're like, I can't cope with the idea of changing a lot in my business right now. And so I think part of it is having mental and emotional gas in the tank and saying, okay, I could be prepared to change anything about my business quickly and easily. That's the hallmark of small companies. It's like it's the big entrenched businesses that generally have hard time being nimble. Kitchen table entrepreneurs, people who are smaller e-commerce operators, should have the capacity to be more nimble, and so you want to cultivate that in your own mind and heart. And how do you do that? Well, you generally, it's a mental and emotional state you're in. You're not burned out. You're not frustrated or locked into systems, people, process, or sources. You've got a mindset that says, what are my alternatives, and having the energy emotionally to explore those, and being open-minded versus closed-minded about such things. You have on the conversation talking points this fantastic um, phrase, which is willingness to let go of sunk costs, and I think that's key to this. That having a mind share space that says, I don't care what it cost me a year or two or three ago to do this or that or the other thing. I'm going to be willing to say, let's go, let's pivot as needed to meet market forces. And I think that's key.
Yeah.
That ability to say, no, I'm not going to be tied by my investments in past thinking, systems, process, products, tools, whatever.
Mm.
The sunk cost fallacy is not going to snag me up. And I think that's really central to the idea of being just kind of mentally with it and ready to make changes. So.
Yeah, I agree in that entirely. So just on the sunk costs, a couple of thoughts. One is it's easy to say and really hard to do. So I have to recognize it's emotional work. And that sounds like a funny sort of new agey word, but overly woke or something. But my experience is it's very real. You have to find some process, whatever it is, anything from psychotherapy to drinks with your friends, running, I don't know, whatever it is, commiserating with people at an Amazon conference, whatever processes you personally find to let go of the fact that your product, which was beautiful 12 months ago, 6 months ago, in the crazy times we live in, is suddenly no longer viable, or the supply chain that worked beautifully is absolutely broken to pieces because your suppliers in Shanghai, if that is right now, could be the case. So that's one thing, to recognize that what we're saying is a big ask, but I think a critical one. The other, so it's sort of emotional fitness is a business skill, if you want. It sounds like a funny thing to say, but I think it is as a business leader. The second thing is related to that, a seemingly innocuous and actually grown-up business practice can, I think, create a sort of sunk cost fallacy without you realizing, which is year-on-year growth projections, year-on-year profitability, and so forth. Feels like what grown-up companies do, and it is. But there's an inherent trap in that, and you're expecting last year to be a version of this year to be a version of last year, bigger or smaller. Whereas if the dynamics have changed violently since last year, that's no longer a very helpful way of thinking, is my opinion. So I think that there can be a trap there, and I find that amongst the biggest sellers I work with,
Yeah.
who are quite robust and dealt with crises before, but they do get trapped into, oh, my sales are down on last year. And I think as a comparison point, that's not a very helpful starting point. So there you
Yeah.
go.
No, I totally agree that, I was just listening to a podcast the other day, and they said one of the tests for intelligence is they'll do the simple games like, how many words can you create out of these letters in like 60 seconds? Or, how many number combinations you can make out of this or that? And these simple games, simple tests around creativity. And the ability to create is a de facto a measure of intelligence. And the reason sunk cost fallacy is interesting is because if you're pure creative as an entrepreneur, you're like, we could do this, 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 and this. The sunk cost fallacy will truncate 3, 4, 5 of those, and you'll say, no, no, I can't do that because, or no, I can't do this because. And so it cuts down your creative like energy, and that's the reason it's sort of the party spoiler, and that you really have to address it, because in moments like these, geopolitics going crazy with supply side and demand side changing, inflation, and container costs and sourcing costs, and all of these things, you want to be maximally creative, and sunk cost fallacy will down that vibe. And that's the reason why technically I think it's important to identify it as a spoiler, and then say, no, I've got to be maximally creative right now. I've got to look at all the options available and really brainstorm to the maximum to figure out how I can be effective going forward in this crazy market times. So I think that's interesting. And you're right. It is sort of mental health, or kind of mental health fitness, I guess you could say,
Something
as a
like that.
leader of your company, something like that. Yeah. It's
It
very
is. I mean,
interesting.
it's the difference between being Pollyannish and saying, no, everything's going to be fine. Then an alternative is, and by the way, this is probably phases you go through as an entrepreneur. Like they said, the phases of grief quite similar to some of the phases of being an entrepreneur. It is an emotional roller coaster. It's going to be fine. Oh my goodness, it's really not. I can't believe the war started. I can't believe China's gone into lockdown. I can't believe X, Y, Z. I can't believe that the tariffs were imposed in 2016, etc. Right? And then there's a kind of, okay, how can I resourcefully respond to this? And to your point, letting go of mental baggage then enables you to access that creativity that, as you say, has got to be the hallmark of an entrepreneur.
Yeah. Just
And
one.
yeah.
Yeah. Just one last thought on this idea. Um, it's no surprise why in tumultuous times many businesses fail.
Mm,
And you ask the question, why did these companies fail? Well, sometimes they got boxed into a capital constraint and they literally ran out of money. Sometimes they were in a business that just collapsed because of market changes, on the demand side, and there they were, holding the VHS tape players, when no one else wanted to buy VHS tape players, or those kinds of scenarios. But I guess that my point is, it's in radical market conditions like this when you will see entrenched players really fall apart and new upstarts really take advantage and take market share. This is the time in which those who cannot pivot and cannot be nimble will fail, and those who are starting or those who can will take that void space and make it their business and become a thing because they had an opportunity because someone else was too rigid to take advantage of the opportunity that was rightfully theirs. It's almost like their inheritance going into the change economy is theirs to take, but they can't take it because they're not nimble. They lose it, someone else takes it. This is
Yeah.
very interesting times, you know. It's just
Yes,
weird.
they are very interesting times. That the Chinese curse, of course, may you live in interesting times. But I mean, it could be a curse or a blessing depending on, as you say, how rigid or flexible and creative you are, and how resourceful you are. Talking of resources, we better talk about capital. You put that on the list, which I didn't originally put on our list, and you're absolutely right. We got to talk
Yeah,
about that because one of the
yeah,
reasons businesses fail is they simply run out of cash to pay their bills when they fall due, i.e.,
yeah.
bankruptcy of some description. What are your thoughts on this? How do we even approach this?
Well, I always send people back to my favorite book of all time, Growing a Business by Paul Hawkins. And he created Smith and Hawken, which is a wonderful company that he sold to, or ultimately got sold to Target. And one of his chapters, I always remember reading it and never needing the information, but being reminded of it in my mind many times. But it was this idea related to money, and his comment was always raise money before you need it. And his thinking was it's easy to raise money when you don't need it. It's near impossible to raise money when you do need it. Therefore, you have to raise money and get your hands on capital, and keep it, you know, and have it when you don't need it. And there's two sides of a hard problem there. Well, one is the discipline of getting it. The other is the discipline of keeping it until you need it. And so his book is genius on that. And I think many people are in this situation where you might have a great cash flowing business and you've never wanted debt, you've never needed money like from outside investors, and you're like, no, I'll just do this on my own devices. And then the geopolitical storm hits, or the tide goes out, or whatever metaphor is, and you realize, gosh, it would have been handy for me to have a big line of credit, or a loan product or something I could tap into, and and having that capital, access to that capital in times like these, I
Mm,
think is one of the central themes of those who make it, those who survive, just
mm,
have more financing options. And so I think having access to capital, whether you stockpiled it yourself and you're just a genius hoarder of cash,
mm,
or whether you've got loan products available to you or whatever, is going to be um, a kingmaker,
mm,
or it's going to be a spoiler for people who are otherwise good operators. And I think that's the hard part, is people who can say, I'm a great operator. I
mm.
don't have any debt. I
Yeah.
run a great cash flow business, but the market
Mm,
just changed and I'm ruined. And like, but I know I was a good operator. Well, yes, you were, but you didn't have capital. And I think those are the things to think about right now.
two
What are your thoughts on
response.
that?
Yeah, two
Yeah.
responses. I agree with everything you said. To the point of credit lines or loans, and you were wanted to distinguish, I think, absolutely rightly between diversifying and preparing to pivot or preparing to diversify. And this is a fantastic case in point. Um, to your point, you don't have to get out a loan as a source of funding. So, source of funding, diversification, or preparing to diversify, or pivoting. Right? Those are the three options. Prepare, diversify, or actually pivot. Um, you can have a line of credit set up with a lending institution, or multiple lines of credit with multiple lending institutions, and you don't necessarily, depending on the terms of your agreement, have to use them. But to the point, Paul Hawkins, excellent point, so true. They say a banker will, give you a coat to use until it starts, give you an umbrella when it's dry, and then as soon as it starts raining, they take it back off you. And that's the joke, isn't it? And there is something very strong in that. So yeah, if you loan up credit, you don't have to take the loan, but it's ready. And that is exactly what you were saying, preparing to pivot without actually actioning it. And that's super smart because you're giving yourself options, and it gives you maximum options for the future. The other thing is, great operators without capital won't survive. Well, I guess what that means is there will be a massive transfer of wealth and assets from the people who are good operators and built a beautiful brand but can't afford to run it anymore.
There will be
People with capital who want to buy a beautiful brand.
hmm
That implies to me. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it reminds me of exactly what I said this on our call-in podcast on Tuesday morning, which is, by the way, on the call-in app. If you haven't checked that out yet, go do that. We've got Chris Green and Kyle Hamer who join us for a four-way conversation. But my comment there was to look at what Elon Musk did with Twitter at the meta level, which was identify an asset that was valuable that he saw huge potential in. Um, you know, in essence, editing its operating business with his tweaks, changes, and perceived improvements, and he bought it. And the geopolitics that we're entering, and the inflationary stage we're entering in the economy, and many people are predicting massive recession ahead, and all of this hardship. I think the primary idea here is there will be massive transfer of business ownership. Many baby boomers are just done. They're done. They're in their late 60s or 70s. They've had a good run since the 80s or whenever. They're ready to sell off their business, whether they were e-commerce operators at this point or just brick and mortar. That whole wave of change by itself is a massive wave of business transition, let alone all the people who get themselves into trouble as e-commerce operators who have created brands or good product lines, whatever it is, and they will not have the ability to proceed. And for those who are ready, willing, and able to step in and make that kind of change happen and be the new owner of a hurt or a struggling business, or maybe it's a beautiful product line that's just being run by someone who's just done.
Mm.
um, this is the time in which these changes will occur at massive acceleration. And my only commentary on Tuesday was, you learn to be a business buyer
Yeah.
and have capital and be nimble. I mean, these are the elements that go into succeeding in this tumultuous time.
Yeah, I guess some people will be in a position to buy businesses if they're a business in a good position, and others will be simply, surviving, I suppose. So it depends on your position. But either which way, objectively, if you zoom back from the individual's position, you're so right that there are going to be transfers of assets. Big transfers tend to happen in times of crisis. And I really love the fact you brought in demographics there, because as a sort of disciple of Peter Zion's thinking, which is geography and demographics, so they're not exactly destiny, but they're closest we can get to very reliable predictors of what will happen over the longer term. I think the baby boom retirement was always going to be a thing. And I think that COVID has shown that up, because one of the reasons I suspect that there's a Labour market shortage in the US, Europe, UK, everywhere really, is because a lot of people just retired during COVID and they're not coming back into the workplace. The other thing that you just put your finger on is the other thing of the transfer of baby boomers owning assets and selling them off. Literally, my father is older than a baby boomer. He's I suppose the silent generation, but he's literally just sold off some commercial property because he was done with managing it. And that's not untypical. They don't want the stress anymore. And so I think what's happened with the last couple of sort of geopolitical shocks, COVID and now wars in Ukraine, to start with for the moment, is that they have accelerated an underlying trend anyway, which is very interesting. And so I like the fact you brought that in.
Yeah. Okay, so the next part of our conversation, I think, is kind of like identifying the opportunities to pivot or to make change reality in your business. And these fall into categories.
Yeah.
Where do you look? How do you see opportunities in the market space to either shift your own work differently into a new way, or for businesses that are in those spaces that maybe are in need of a rescue? And
Mm.
so those fall into different categories, I guess. You've broken it down here. One is to look at the supply side.
Yeah.
Um, you know, oh, go ahead, jump in. Either way.
Yeah, I mean, you can break it up any which way you want. I guess, I mean, my instinct is to start with the demand side, because if there's
Mhm.
no demand, you don't even need to worry about the supply. And just
Sure.
on that point, for example, Germany is the second biggest Amazon marketplace in the world. It's the most powerful economy, and it's got wealthy consumers that buy a lot of physical goods. Germany's demand could just drop off a cliff pretty much at any point if that, for example, somebody in Ukraine blows up all the pipelines coming from Russia to Germany, which would make sense because they're getting €1 billion a day, about $1 billion a day. The Russians are from Europeans to pay for oil as it stopped flowing. But that could happen. Russia could turn it off, or the Europeans could decide that they're willing to bite the bullet and collectively, under the pressure probably of the US, turn those taps off from their side. So there are three parties in this conflict that could cause that to happen. If that happens, then Germany's going to go into the most almighty recession since the Second World War. I think is pretty predictable, which means that demand side could crater pretty instantly. I don't know whether it takes 1 or 2 or 3 months to feed through, or 1 or 2 weeks, or people just panic. That's hard to predict.
Yeah.
But that's an example that if you sell, for example, just in Germany, of why geographical diversification of your market, so who you sell to and where the demand actually is, could change so rapidly that I think diversifying, as in not just preparing to sell, but actually getting on with selling in the US, I would say is a necessity now. And that's not an easy ask, because the US is big markets, requires more capital, is hyper competitive, and it's a cultural shift as well. Selling to Germans is not the same as selling to Americans. So it's a big ask, but I think it's really important to consider that sort of thing now.
So the simple question is, where's demand?
Yes, exactly.
And to your point, demand could be so volatile. Like, I hadn't thought about Germany, but I will tell you, I think the Europeans think, oh, you better start selling in the U.S. But if you're here in the U.S., you do the same thing. You just think, oh, well, the U.S. is kind of, cooked. Where else can I sell? And, a lot of smart people are jumping into Mercado Libre and selling into the Central and South American markets, which is because it's a marketplace that's really booming. And they've opened the process and systems for U.S. sellers to send into the Mercado Libre system, and those products go to Florida, and then they go to Central and South America through their system. And so, but the underlying question is, where is demand, and how can I put myself in the system where demand exists? As we all know, it's near impossible to create demand. It's so much easier to just fulfill for when people want something, you're there ready to go. And so I think that's very interesting, and I hadn't thought about that, but that nimbleness, the ability to pivot on the just that question of where is demand, I think is a foundational component of somebody who's going to be weathering this storm effectively going forward as an e-commerce operator.
I think the question of where is demand is an excellent question. You're not wrong. When in a more volatile market, or markets, or global situation, I think an additional question which we have to ask now, which we have the luxury of not asking, is the more speculative question of where will demand be. So what I was talking about isn't where Germany is right now, because as at the time of recording, what I'm talking about has I was going to say the nuclear scenario, but sadly that's no longer metaphorical. That is an actual scenario. So I don't mean nuclear scenario. I mean the really bad but not nuclear scenario that Germany's demand simply falls through the floor. It's speculation, but it's not idle speculation, because the underlying mechanics of the situation are pretty obvious. If you are sitting in a car teetering on the edge of a cliff and you're wondering whether physics is going to push you off the cliff or onto the cliff, you don't have to be a genius to know that it's nevertheless a substantial risk, so you should get out of the car. It's not the greatest metaphor ever come up with in a business podcast, but you get the idea. And I do feel like people have a terrible tendency to think tomorrow's going to be like yesterday, for no particularly good reason except kind of habit, and that's understandable. I'm not criticizing, but I think that's dangerous thinking in a situation like this, where demand is a great question, but where is good demand going to be? Or another way of looking at it is where's the risk that it will stop, is another way of looking at it.
So that's on the marketplace side, which we just at the high level, 30,000 foot view, you have to say, as e-commerce operators, it's a beautiful time to be an e-commerce operator. There's more and more marketplaces opening up all over the world. On the whole, so there are more options to pivot, even in tumultuous times. And thankfully, those European e-commerce operators that are selling primarily into Germany right now could do the pivot. It's like there's nothing that stops them from doing the pivot as needed to the U.S. or to Central South America, or to whatever markets suit them. They literally can just boot it up, work through the details, and
they can.
Okay,
the only thing I would
say,
when you said there's nothing that stops them, it on a sort of broadest pictures perspective, you're absolutely right. And I suppose one, I'm encouraging that people should do that. I have to say, one note of reality is that the capital required to break into the US market might be 5 times what's required with a similar product line in Germany. So that's one thing I would say. And back to the point you were talking about with capital raising, if you have a good track record as an operator and you can sell whoever your equity partners, your lenders on the idea that you're going to make it big in America, then you may find the capital is raisable, but you will need to raise that capital, and that is not a small thing. That's all I would say.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, many details are provoked by such an idea. Yeah.
Yes, they are.
Um,
So
yeah,
other types of pivots. I guess we should
yeah.
talk about product category pivots. What are your thoughts about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the general consensus of um, recession based um, product presentation versus boom time product presentation is something to think about. Some product lines are just built for recessionary periods. We own one of those, Pixie Fair's sewing patterns, and sewing patterns are for people who sew things rather than buy things. Well, who sews things rather than buy things? Well, hobbyists do, or people who are financially constrained do. And so, I mean, we've done our business since 2007, 2008. We started on eBay. We were power sellers originally. And then in 2009, we got into the sewing patterns, not just the manufacturing or making of the items. And what we learned through all of these years is um, if it's easy to buy something as a giftable thing, people will do that. It's harder to make something as a giftable thing. But if you're in the business of helping people make things, then in a recessionary time, you've got what people want more than in a non-recessionary time. And I guess if you can follow that logic, then you get my point. There are products that work well in recessions, and there are products that work well in boom times. And you want to evaluate what you're selling in light of that concept and think through, okay, if people are constrained financially, are they still going to be buying my Birkin bag for $40,000 or my, a Rolex watch? Now the answer might be, yeah, because I sell it to billionaires and I don't really care. But the answer might be, oh, well, this is a luxury item for the middle class. And in a recession, they're not going to be buying my luxury item. And that's the kind of thinking you want to bring to it. And then the question is, well, if I'm selling an item that's in jeopardy of being out of favor, how could I be nimble enough to pivot? And is there a product that's similar that actually works well for a recessionary period, as my current product line does for a boom period? And that line of thinking is sort of, you're sort of playing out, okay, what's worst case, best case, and what product fits in both of those cases. And you might have a product that hasn't done well at all for the prior, 6, 7, 8, 9 years boom time period. But as soon as recession hits, that product will be your new golden, you know, much loved product that you'll want to scale up. Stuff like that happens. And so I think that's an important thing to think through, just in terms of what you're offering and whether it fits the times, I guess would be the way to express it.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think that's very important, and I guess that's a specific version of the kind of message to market match. And I suppose what we're talking about is the people stay the same, but their mentality changes because their situation's changed, or at least to be more sophisticated, their perception of their situation's changed. I guess that's what actually drives is in motivation, what drives action, right? What drives
Yeah.
behavior is
Yep.
perception of what's happening rather than actually what's happening. But
Yeah.
yeah, interesting that the demographic hasn't changed, but their experience of life has changed, and so their behaviors changed. The other thing the other thing I wanted to say is this is a perfect example of, again, you don't necessarily have to go from one thing and pivot to another. You may find you have to do that over time, but the starting point for me would be also always to diversify, to have some products that, as you say, you believe should behave well in a recession, some products that behave well in a boom time, and then to see what the market actually says. And if you are forced to pivot, then at least you have a foot in two camps, as it were. Whereas if you're trying to start from zero
Yeah.
and you have to pivot in a hurry, then that's going to be very hard to do, and you're at a disadvantage relative to the competition who's already established in those markets as well, I would say.
And you said a few minutes ago, message to market match is kind of,
Mm,
one of the elements here. And it could be as simple as retooling all your copywriting.
true.
Maybe you've got a set of benefits and features that emphasize the exciting upside of having your product, but maybe in recessionary times you want to retool your copywriting so that you have an emphasis on how it saves money, how it lasts longer, how it is indestructible. All of those elements that would satiate someone's need or desire for the product not being necessarily repurchased quickly, which is, as e-commerce operators, not what we want to have happen. But obviously it's in the best interest of the customer.
Mm.
Planned obsolescence is the phrase people use for many products that you just have to throw them away after 3 years because they don't work anymore. Well, in a recessionary time, you better not be making that claim
No.
or even presenting things in that fashion, because people are going to want to lean into good value for money, long lasting, all of those types of things. And that copywriting, and it could be all true. I mean, I'm not saying bend the truth. I'm saying just what you present, what you put out there as your first selling feature or point in your copy might need to be adjusted in light of these hard times. So it's an interesting angle as well. It might not even be a product change; it just be a product retooling.
Yeah, sort of repositioning, if you want to put that, or retooling the copy. Another type of repositioning that you've implied, which applies to a couple of my clients actually, is that you guys have with the downloadable patterns for sewing, it appeals to hobbyists, but it also appeals to people who might, in a recessionary situation, turn their hobby into a work. And I've got another client who's got helps people with baking products, and again, quite a lot of people, to judge from the quantities they order and some of the product photos and feedback that he gets, are doing this as a kind of micro business. And actually, in a
Mm,
recession, those sort of things, I guess, are very likely to grow, because traditional employers may be downsizing, and people will be, rather like in the pandemic, when there are sort of spikes in interest in e-commerce marketing and stuff, because people are going, oh my goodness, I need to make an alternative source of income. And I think that's interesting that for
yeah.
certain products, for you, it happens to be, for my clients, in some clients, that could be a micro pivot. And again, it's a repositioning rather than the whole full on pivot. That you appeal more strongly, you tweak to copy to say this could be a business kind of thing, or a hobby becoming a
hmm
micro business.
Well, what you just put your finger on is an interesting pivot in itself, which is, and we have clients that do this. They start with a B2C product, and they're trying to find individual consumers to buy for personal use. And then what they discover is that there's actually commercial use of the product. Schools, restaurants, uh, offices, things where people will buy in bulk, and you're not really set up or productized, packaged for bulk purchasing, but you realize, oh my gosh, people will buy this in 50 or 100 count packaging rather than just in a 2 pack. And that B2B business switch, that pivot, sometimes people don't do pivots or switches like that, because in good times you're like, I'm good. I'm selling to the individuals, and yes, I probably could make some money if I switch to selling bulk for B2B, but we're kind of busy. But in hard times, in the recessionary times, and you're like, how do we survive? Like, yes, we now have a product line that's designed exactly for the dentist's office or the doctor's office or the schools or the churches or the restaurants, whatever it is. And the hard times force you to lean into something that was there all the time. And
Yeah.
so that packaging and customer type of customer pivot, I think, is one that's maybe there for people and they haven't taken advantage of it. And it will just be emphasized because of the market conditions. Yeah.
By the way, that's a tweetable. I really like that. Tweetable from Jason Miles, not myself. Hard times force you to lean into things that were there all the time. I really like that, because I think it's absolutely true. There's another phrase on the other side of the ledger, if you like, that is bad habits breeding good times. And ignoring opportunities because you're kind of fat and happy as a business, it is not great practice anyway. I mean, yes, in the short term maybe you're too busy to focus on it, but in the medium term it probably should be something you'd exploit and put a team member onto. The other thing I'd like to say about that very simple pivot is actually can be very, very simple but profoundly good for your bottom line. And I've got another client in the mastermind who's selling products that are in the sort of catering space, where he's realized, like you just said, that there is a mass market for schools, restaurants, offices, and actually you can get Amazon to just fulfill by the carton. So literally the cartons you sent in, shipping cartons, they just send them back out again, and then suddenly you've got a
Yep.
B2B business without any real big
It
change,
was
which is
there
fantastic.
easily. Yeah, that's amazing.
So another thing we ought to talk about, and you are the man to talk about digital products, is the pivot from physical products to digital, or rather, again, is it a pivot or is it a diversification, an addition rather than a change? That's something that I find very little adoption of amongst my mastermind members so far, and I always feel that's an incredible opportunity that we're missing. And again, to your point, the hard times may force them to lean into things that were there all the time. If you spent 30 years selling a product line or serving a particular type of customer, then you probably have incredible expertise that you could package into multiple different types of information products or
Yeah,
books or training. And so you guys are the expert at that because you did that very thing. So
yeah,
talk us through that.
yeah. It is one of those things where it was there all the time. And what the reason people will pivot to it is because they'll look at their cost structure and they'll say, "My goodness, we can't afford to spend this much money acquiring customers by, having a loss leader product." And then then someone will say, "Well, what else could we give you know the the customer to get them in house?" And you're like, "Oh, well, how about a how-to guide? How about a digital product? There's zero cost of goods. Wait, it's free to us." And that kind of line of thinking, because of the stress and pressure of finances on the lead side, the lead acquisition side, finding new customers, that will lead people to digital products. And depending on the marketplace and the how customers operate in that space, and whether they have a demand for information that's obvious and it can be fulfilled with either a free item or with a paid item, the business will then explore those. I would call them kind of a modality shift from physical to digital, and that shift is there for everyone. And I've just beat this drum and no one dances around the fire, but I don't care, because I'm going to keep saying the same thing over and over. If you're an e-commerce operator and if you're not using digital goods to acquire and grow your customer base, then you are leaving a lot of energy on the table, and that is a mistake. And you will discover the error in that in the pressure of hard times, and you'll be grateful that you made the change. And not to be too antagonistic about it, but it is there. It's there already, and people just don't want to do the work to figure
Yeah.
out, how do you rig up a digital good? How do you make this work through your Shopify site? Or can you do this on? I'm an Amazon seller. I can't
Hmm.
do this. On and on and on the excuses go. But under the constraint and pressure of the crush of a down economy, you will find the gem in the digital goods, and you will love it. And it just will happen if you really lean in that direction. And I guarantee it. I mean, it will happen if the more you spend time exploring how to create and sell digital goods, either again for free or for money, and how they benefit your business, the more you'll see the economic advantages of near zero marginal cost and instant deliverability and the whole host of benefits of digital. So you can tell I'm on my soapbox right now. Like, I'm all fired up about it, but it's just because it's such an obvious thing once you've
Yeah.
done it, once you're there. And, we built our whole business around this for, 12, 13 years now, 14 years. And that there are so many other people who could build a business around digital that don't. And they don't because they can sell the physical items and make a decent margin. And they've driven into a cul-de-sac that they're hanging out in, and they haven't had to, by pressure, look for other options. So there you go. That's my soapbox sermon on digital goods.
No, I'm all for you banging that drum. I try and do it, on your behalf amongst my, well, not for your sake, but for their sake amongst the mastermind members. I haven't really kind of banged the drum hard enough because, as you say, I guess partly to be fair, we're all very, very busy owner operators of any business. But also, there is, again, we talked about a mentality shift, and this brings this nicely full circle. The sunk cost fallacy comes in lots of ways. Like, you've learned a lot about physical products, and then you come up with the idea of maybe creating a book or a video course or whatever other modality it might be, and people think, oh gosh, no, I can't be bothered with that. I've learned a lot about physical products, and I don't want to pivot. And that actually is a very commonsensical reaction in the sense of sticking to your knitting as a strategy decision, if if it makes sense economically. But as you say, near zero marginal cost is critical when the actual cost of raw materials, transport, fulfillment, everything is going up. And then the deliverability piece has gone from always being a difficult thing with physical goods to being really not only very, very difficult, much more delayed, but not certain that you'll ever get the goods. I mean, there are people in 2020 who ordered goods in February and got them in December. Which is kind of crazy. I mean, friends of mine, and that meant obviously just a monster hole in their cash flow, and in their the money was tied up for months, and that's in an era when we had lockdowns in the West, but actually not much in China, weirdly enough. So that
Yeah.
ability to
Yeah.
bypass that whole nightmare is for me just incredibly profound,
Yeah.
really important.
And I would also say that that's why in times of economic recession or big down economies, this is why some companies will leap forward and take market share because it's a very simple storyline. A recession hits every player in a niche. The player that can lower their cost of acquisition or their operating costs and still generate good margin or revenue wins. And they win on a daily basis, they win on a margin percentage basis, and then they start outspending on advertising. And what you'll see is in the down economy, those businesses that have not incorporated digital into their strategy will have such a tremendously costly business that they're operating that they will grind to a screeching halt on the obvious things like advertising, staffing, investment in new products. And those that have more margin because they've introduced digital into their product suite and acquisition strategies will just have more gas in the tank. And they'll be able to spend more on a daily basis on AdWords and on social media ads to acquire new customers. And it'll be like a screeching halt for the one that doesn't have a digital game plan, and it'll be like a tailwind or a lift for the other that does have the digital strategy. And there you go. In every niche and industry, you'll see players that just didn't embrace a digital strategy um, wind down. Maybe they close altogether. Maybe they go bankrupt. Maybe they just are hurt with market share. And those that do have the digital strategy will take share and grow and flourish and survive. And it's not rocket science understanding that. It's obvious. It's plain as day. And when you understand the economics behind physical product business versus digital product business. And so I do think that we'll see more and more of that adoption by force or adoption by requirement of digital products and digital, resources for customers because if you're competing and you're surviving, but you see a competitor growing and scaling and they're doing the digital, then you'll be a copycat, but you'll survive because you'll be like, oh my gosh, everybody in my industry started doing digital goods.
Yeah.
I therefore did them too. I was dragged into it by requirement. Um, or it'll happen so fast that you go bankrupt and the other people who had pivoted and had a layer of digital fat, I guess you could call it,
Mm.
in their profit and loss statement. They survive healthily through the winter, and you've run out of energy, and they've continued on for prosperous times.
So just to make sure we're crystal clear for anyone listening, so digital strategy meaning digital products, i.e., informational based products, or
Hmm.
in
Yeah.
products made of electrons, not atoms, as they put it. Yeah.
Hmm. Exactly
So
right.
here's one thought about this is I was reflecting on the phrase that springs to mind from what you're saying is necessity is the mother of invention. You know, when the pressure's on, you get creative because you have to, which I think is very, very healthy. It's the opposite of bad habits breeding good times. But what I think is very interesting, you just flagged up what I think I see most people actually doing, which includes myself. We're higher order primates, monkey see, monkey do. That's how monkeys work. That's how humans work. It's what in our genes. But we can go beyond that because we can think and plan and act the great human ability if we choose to embrace that. And so I think necessity is an interesting word because that's a perception question, isn't it? I think a lot of people right now don't perceive the necessity of doing something until the competition does it. And then even though they don't know why, they just kind of think, oh, I better do it because it's not working anymore. Whereas I'm with you, which is to say, it's necessary in the environment we're in and all the factors we've put in, recession, supply chain issues, etc., to pivot. And for me, the simple question is, are you going to wait till everyone else has realized it in your tail end? Charlie, to your point, it may be too late by then because they've taken market share. It could happen very fast. Or you're going to anticipate and do it now, be the person that moves first. And I think that first mover advantage accrues, can accrue a huge amount of stuff if you follow up on it well. And I hope that what we're doing today is encouraging everyone to be the leader, literally, of their market, and to be the person that examines the dynamics, thinks through their supply chain, thinks through the demand side, is really consciously forming a strategy, and they may have the courage then to make those bold moves.
Yeah. No, totally right. I think that's the right way to approach it. Well, wonderful conversation, man. You want to give us the overview recap of the show here and wrap us up?
Yeah, I'll try and sort of summarize the best I can. So I guess the problem we're dealing with is a demand side and supply side problem. It is global in scope and probably not going to go away, which is really the background for why we're going to do this. We talked about preparing to pivot, and the next stage being possibly diversifying and then actually pivoting, a sort of meta strategies that go across everything else. Being nimble, being willing to change your mentality, and get mental and emotional gas in the tank, as you put it, is really important. That should be a trademark for small businesses. That should be something we can lean into, this ability, letting go of sunk costs as quickly as possible, and preparing yourself for that sort of pivoting thing. Being aware of when market changes happen, and so on the demand side, staying attuned to that, and as you say, maybe reshaping your messaging to meet the sort of recession mentality of the consumers, possibly changing up your product mix if you need to have goods that are more recession proof. You may wish to consider business to consumer things, and some products lend themselves to becoming business to business, and depends how you find business. It could be a micro business. And then not least, as you said, and I'm utterly with you in this, the modality pivot, that you may wish to consider adding digital products to the mix and adding, as you say, that digital fat to your profit and loss. And if you get in there first, then you're the person with more money to spend on gaining market share through being able to afford more advertising and outspending your competition, then you can be in a beautiful place to take market share. So it could be the best possible time to be in business, which is a strange thing to say, but I think you're right. It is when the wealth is transferred, and it could be you that gets to benefit. Well, while Jason's just dealing with the tech issues his side, let's just first of all say thank you very much to everyone who's watching and listening. Don't forget that if you want to find us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any other place, you just look for The E-Commerce Leader. We're out on all the podcast media, I should say. If you want to join us live on Call-In, we have the Hot Take Show on Tuesdays at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. UK time, 5 p.m. Central European time, where we have a panel discussion with Chris Green, Kyle Hamer, and Jason and myself. Looks like we've lost Jason, so I'll just say thank you very, very much for listening, everybody, and we'll wrap up there and look forward to speaking to you soon on The E-Commerce Leader.